Number 1. Dorothea Punt. She looked like everybody's grandmother. Soft grey curls, wire-rimmed glasses, a kind word for anyone who walked through her door, and a habit of pressing a home-cooked plate of food into the hands of anyone who looked hungry. But underneath the floorboards and buried in the backyard of her Sacramento boarding house, Dorothea Punt was hiding the coldest secret in California history, and it took a missing man with a childlike mind, a suspicious social worker, and one slipped note from a frightened tenant for anyone to finally notice. By the 1980s, downtown Sacramento's F Street was a working-class stretch of Victorian duplexes, the kind of neighborhood where families had lived for generations, where porches faced the street, and where nobody asked too many questions about the comings and goings of struggling tenants moving in and out of subdivided rooming houses. At number 1426 stood a boarding house that, from the sidewalk, looked like a small act of charity in a city that, like most American cities in that decade, was quietly failing its most vulnerable residents, the mentally ill deinstitutionalized by state hospital closures, the elderly living alone on fixed incomes, the addicts trying to get sober with nowhere structured to go. Dorothea Helen Punt, born Dorothea Helen Gray on January 9, 1929, in Redlands, California, had spent decades constructing a persona of maternal generosity that masked a much darker reality. She organized community meetings where she offered to help the down and outs set up their Social Security accounts, sometimes even inviting people to move directly into her home. She dressed in vintage clothing, wore oversized glasses, and let her hair go naturally gray, a look that, as one crime historian later observed, seemed deliberately calculated to project harmlessness and warmth. Beneath that image was a career criminal with a rap sheet stretching back years, convictions for forgery and fraud, a documented history of drugging vulnerable people to steal from them, and an earlier stint running an unlicensed boarding house just blocks away from the F Street address that would eventually make her infamous. In 1982, Punt was convicted of theft and forgery after drugging 4 elderly victims specifically to steal their Social Security checks, and a judge sentenced her to 5 years in prison. It was during that incarceration that she began a pen-pal correspondence with a 77-year-old retiree from Oregon named Everson Gilmouth, a lonely man who would, upon her release, become not a friend but one of her earliest known victims. After walking free, Punt wasted no time reopening her boarding house operation, and this time the scheme escalated from theft into murder. Investigators would eventually come to believe she was dosing her tenants with combinations of sedatives, including a powerful prescription sleep aid, administered covertly in food or drink until their bodies simply gave out. Then, under cover of darkness, in a routine so practiced it chilled detectives who later reconstructed it, she would drag the bodies through the house, down the staircase, and out into the small yard, where she buried them in shallow graves beneath rose bushes and along the fence line. Remarkably, she kept collecting her victims' government checks for months after their deaths, going so far as to write letters to concerned family members in the victims' names, claiming they were simply too unwell or too embarrassed by their circumstances to write themselves. The unraveling began in November of 1988. A Volunteers of America outreach counselor named Judy Moyes had referred one of her clients, a developmentally disabled man in his early 50s named Alvaro Bert Montoya, who also suffered from schizophrenia, to Punt's boarding house. When Montoya suddenly stopped showing up for his scheduled check-ins, Moyes grew increasingly alarmed. She knew Montoya was a creature of habit, not someone who would simply vanish without explanation, and she filed a missing person report with Sacramento police. On November 11, 1988, Sacramento police detectives John Cabrera and Terry Brown, accompanied by a federal probation agent, arrived at the F Street address to question Punt about Montoya's whereabouts. Punt, composed and cooperative on the surface, told the investigators a story about Montoya having left suddenly, offering nothing that immediately raised alarm. But then something unexpected happened. One of her own tenants managed to slip the detectives a note, warning them, in effect, that their landlady was lying to their faces. That single piece of paper changed the entire trajectory of the case. Detectives asked for permission to search the property's yard. What they found beneath the soil chilled even seasoned homicide investigators who had seen plenty in their careers. The first shovel strikes uncovered a badly decomposed body. Then another. Then detectives kept digging, and kept finding more, a discovery that would ultimately total 7 bodies unearthed from a modest residential garden that neighbors had walked past for years without a hint of suspicion. In one of the case's most audacious twists, while investigators were still actively excavating her yard, Punt, remaining eerily calm throughout the entire process, asked officers for permission to step away and meet a nephew for tea at a nearby hotel, explaining that her nerves needed settling after such a disturbing discovery on her property. Astonishingly, the detectives let her go. She never returned. What followed was a 4-day manhunt that stretched from Sacramento down to Los Angeles, ending only when Punt, who had been drinking at a bar and chatting up an elderly man she'd hoped might become her next target, was recognized by that very man from television news coverage of the excavation. He quietly alerted police, and Punt was arrested without incident. The 7 bodies recovered from the yard were eventually identified as Leona Carpenter, 81 years old, Dorothy Miller, 65, Alvaro Montoya, 52, the very man whose disappearance had triggered the investigation, Benjamin Fink, 55, James Gallup, 6-4, Vera Faye Martin, 65, and Betty Palmer, 80. Palmer's case proved especially disturbing to investigators. Her head, hands, and feet had been removed from her remains and were never recovered, making it nearly impossible for the coroner's office to establish an official cause of death specific to her killing. Prosecutors further connected Punt to 2 additional deaths beyond the yard: Everson Gilmouth, her Oregon pen pal, whose body had earlier been discovered inside a wooden box along a riverbank hundreds of miles from Sacramento, and Ruth Monroe, a friend and one-time business partner of Punt's who had died in 1982 from an overdose of codeine and acetaminophen, a death that, at the time, investigators had simply ruled a suicide, never suspecting the woman comforting Monroe's grieving relatives was in fact her killer. In total, prosecutors charged Punt with 9 counts of murder. Her 1993 trial, ultimately relocated to Monterey County due to overwhelming pre-trial publicity throughout Sacramento, became a genuine national sensation, arguably one of the earliest instances of the kind of nationwide true crime media obsession that would come to define the genre decades later, long before streaming platforms turned her story into required viewing. Prosecutors built a methodical case portraying Punt as a calculating predator who deliberately selected victims specifically because they were isolated, socially invisible, and unlikely to be missed quickly by anyone who might come looking. The defense, for its part, argued that at least some of the victims may have died of natural causes related to age, illness, or substance abuse, and that while Punt was undeniably dishonest about concealing the deaths and continuing to collect government checks fraudulently, dishonesty about a death was not the same as committing murder. After a lengthy, evidence-heavy trial that stretched on for months, the jury ultimately returned guilty verdicts on 3 counts of murder, 2 of first degree, 1 of second degree, but found itself deadlocked on the remaining 6 counts, unable to reach unanimous agreement on cause of death for several of the more severely decomposed remains, where medical examiners simply could not establish with scientific certainty how or exactly when each victim had died. Punt was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She spent the following 2 decades incarcerated at the California Central Women's Facility, maintaining her innocence in interviews conducted over the years and, according to some former detectives who worked the case, continuing an active correspondence with members of the public who found her story morbidly fascinating. A strange coda to a case built entirely on manipulating the trust of vulnerable strangers. Dorothea Punt died in prison on March 27, 2011, at the age of 82. Today, her former boarding house still stands on F Street in downtown Sacramento, now restored as a private residence, occasionally included on local dark history walking tours where guides point out the exact spots in the yard where investigators once found buried bodies. It remains a chilling architectural reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with menace. Sometimes it wears a housecoat, offers you tea, and asks about your social security check before it takes everything you have, including your life. If this case shook you, imagine living 2 doors down from that house for years and never knowing what was buried beneath the roses. Hit like, drop a comment telling us which details stayed with you the longest, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case so you don't miss the next case in this list, because it only gets more disturbing from here. Number 2. Chad Allen Reed. A family hadn't heard from their loved ones in 5 days. When they finally forced answers out of a landlord who'd been avoiding their calls, they discovered he had already tried to burn away the evidence, not once, but as many as 5 separate times. Battle Creek, Michigan is a quiet, unassuming manufacturing city, historically known as the birthplace of the American cereal industry, the kind of Midwestern town where neighbors still wave from their porches and most disputes never rise above a raised voice across a shared driveway. In October of 2020, that small-town calm was shattered on Post Avenue, where a 56-year-old landlord named Chad Allen Reed rented out the top floor of his home to a couple, 34-year-old Joseph Sal and his girlfriend, 31-year-old Jacqueline Leopard. Friends of the couple would later describe them as inseparable, the kind of pair who would occasionally vanish for a spontaneous road trip without telling anyone their plans, a detail that, tragically, delayed suspicion when they first went quiet. According to police reports and courtroom testimony, tension had been building between Reed and his upstairs tenants for some time before the killings. though the exact source of the friction was never fully aired publicly beyond vague references to ongoing disputes. On October 7, 2020, whatever had been simmering finally boiled over. Reed later told investigators that during a confrontation on the front porch, Sal pulled a knife on him. In what he would insist to police was an act of pure self-defense, Reed drew a handgun and shot Sal dead on the spot. But what happened in the minutes that followed went far beyond anything resembling self-defense. When Leopard, upstairs or nearby, realized what had just happened to her boyfriend, she bolted. Reed gave chase. According to prosecutors and chilling testimony later given by Reed's own aunt, Lynn Marie Pemberton, who relayed what Reed himself had confided to her, Reed caught up to Leopard, beat her, fired at least one additional shot in her direction as she attempted to flee, and when he finally cornered her in the backyard of the property, strangled her to death with his bare hands. Pemberton's account, delivered under oath, painted a portrait not of a man defending himself in a single terrifying moment, but of someone who hunted down a second victim after the first killing was already over. What followed the double killing was a methodical, almost clinical cover-up. According to prosecutors, Reed wrapped both bodies in clear plastic sheeting, dragged them out to his pickup truck, buried them beneath a top, assorted construction debris, and heavy wooden boards, and then drove the loaded truck roughly 1 block away to an abandoned garage, where he left it parked and hidden for several days while he attempted to return to some semblance of normal life. Friends and family of the couple grew increasingly alarmed as days passed without contact, a red flag that eventually overcame their initial assumption the couple had simply taken another one of their impromptu trips. After 5 full days of silence, a family member filed a missing persons report with the Battle Creek Police Department, setting an official investigation into motion. While that investigation into the couple's disappearance was still unfolding, something else happened at the Post Avenue property that would eventually become a critical piece of circumstantial evidence. The house caught fire. It later emerged that someone, police would ultimately conclude it was Reed himself, though he was never separately charged for the arson attempts, had tried to burn the residence down not once, but as many as 5 separate times in the days following the killings, in an apparent, increasingly desperate effort to destroy any remaining forensic evidence inside. A neighbor's tip to a 911 dispatcher during this period, describing a man who appeared to be cleaning the apartment obsessively with bleach, would later become a key piece of circumstantial testimony presented to the jury. Eventually, with the fires failing to fully consume the evidence and investigators closing in, Reed turned himself in and confessed to both killings, though he continued, even in his confession, to insist that the shooting of Sal specifically had been an act of self-defense provoked by the knife. Detectives, however, argued the surrounding physical evidence told a dramatically different story about premeditation and escalating brutality, particularly regarding the extended, violent pursuit and killing of Leopard after she had already witnessed her boyfriend's death and posed no apparent threat to Reed whatsoever. Reed's trial in Calhoun County Circuit Court stretched across roughly a full week in October of 2023, nearly 3 years after the killings. Jurors heard extensively from Reed's aunt, Lynn Marie Pemberton, whose testimony about what Reed had confided to her regarding the porch confrontation and the subsequent chase through the backyard became a central pillar of the prosecution's case. Prosecutors methodically walked the jury through the physical evidence, the plastic-wrapped bodies, the relocated truck, the abandoned garage used as a temporary hiding spot, and a house that had mysteriously caught fire multiple separate times in the days immediately following 2 disappearances. All details prosecutors argued were fundamentally inconsistent with any narrative of a single, spontaneous act of self-defense. The jury didn't buy the defense's argument. After deliberations, Reed was found guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Joseph Sal and first-degree murder in the death of Jacqueline Leopard, along with 4 separate firearm-related charges tied to his illegal possession of the weapon used in both killings. Because this marked Reed's 4th criminal offense under Michigan law, the first-degree murder conviction alone carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without any possibility of parole. At his sentencing hearing in December of 2023, Battle Creek Circuit Court Judge Sarah Lincoln handed down life without parole on the first-degree murder count, followed by a consecutive sentence of 125 years on the second-degree murder charge, a largely symbolic but pointed gesture by the court ensuring Reed would never, under any conceivable legal circumstance, walk free again. Following the sentencing, Leopard's sister, Trinity McAllister, addressed reporters outside the courthouse, expressing profound relief that no other family would ever have to endure what theirs had suffered, and thanking the jury and prosecution for delivering what she described as an outcome her family could finally begin to live with, even as nothing would ever bring her sister back. Neighbors along Post Avenue told local television reporters in the aftermath that they had never suspected the occasional raised voices and tense standoffs they'd overheard from the rental property upstairs would ultimately culminate in a double murder, a grim, all too common reminder that domestic tension between a landlord and the tenants living just one floor above him can escalate into unimaginable violence in ways that almost no one outside those walls ever sees coming until it is far too late to intervene. If this case made your stomach turn, you're not alone, and there are 8 more ahead just as disturbing. Like this video, tell us in the comments which case on this list has shocked you the most so far, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case for more verified true crime investigations. Number 3. David Daniel. He walked into a police precinct at 7 in the morning and calmly told the officer behind the front desk that he had done something horrible. Behind him, inside his own home, 3 bodies were still warm. Queens, New York St. Albans neighborhood is a tight-knit, largely working-class community of single-family homes, many of them legally or informally divided into rental units to help homeowners keep up with property costs in one of the most expensive housing markets in the entire country. That common arrangement, a homeowner renting out portions of his own house to help make ends meet, would turn catastrophically deadly at a property on Milburn Street in November of 2023. David Daniel, 56 years old, owned the home outright and lived there with his girlfriend of 5 years, 51-year-old Colleen Caesar Fields. To help offset his mortgage and living expenses, he also rented out the basement apartment to 2 separate tenants, 57-year-old Wayne Thomas and 55-year-old Yvette Sweeney. According to prosecutors with the Queens District Attorney's Office, Daniel had found himself under mounting pressure on 2 entirely separate fronts in the weeks leading up to the killings. He believed Fields, after 5 years together, was preparing to end their relationship and move out of the home they shared, and simultaneously, his basement tenants had reportedly fallen significantly behind on their rent payments, creating financial strain laid directly on top of his emotional turmoil. In the early morning hours of November 14, 2023, that dual pressure detonated into an act of horrific violence. Officers responding to Daniel's own voluntary walk-in report at the local precinct arrived at the Milburn Street home at approximately 7:16 that morning. In the basement apartment, they discovered Wayne Thomas and Yvette Sweeney lying face up on the floor, each having sustained multiple stab wounds. Climbing to the second floor, officers then found Colleen Fields, face down on a bed in her bedroom, also stabbed multiple times. Emergency medical responders pronounced all 3 victims dead at the scene. Despite an extensive search, the actual murder weapon used in the killings was never recovered by investigators. Surveillance footage from the surrounding neighborhood showed Daniel leaving his home around 6:20 that morning, carrying a garbage bag before entering a vehicle and driving away. Rather than fleeing the area entirely, he instead drove directly to the local police precinct, where he calmly approached the front desk lieutenant and told him he had done a horrible thing, a phrase that would echo repeatedly throughout years of subsequent legal proceedings. He later told detectives in a formal interview that he had simply snapped under the combined weight of the rent dispute with his tenants and what he perceived as the imminent collapse of his 5-year relationship. Daniel was formally arraigned on 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of second-degree murder, along with an additional weapons possession charge, facing the very real possibility of life in prison without parole if ultimately convicted at trial. Prosecutors in Queens District Attorney Melinda Katz's office offered Daniel a negotiated plea deal in March of 2025 that would have capped his eventual sentence at 33 years to life, sparing both sides the emotional toll and uncertainty of a full jury trial. Daniel turned the offer down, a decision that would later draw sharp criticism from the sentencing judge. His trial finally began in early May of 2026, roughly 2.5 years after the killings. Prosecutors methodically laid out what they described as overwhelming evidence: 3 distinct, brutal crime scenes contained within a single home, a voluntary confession-adjacent statement made calmly at a police precinct hours after the killings, and forensic evidence directly tying Daniel to each of the 3 deaths. Notably, Daniel's own defense attorney conceded in open court that her client had never once denied committing the killings. Instead, the defense strategy centered almost entirely on his psychological state at the moment of the attacks, arguing the killings represented the product of an extreme, sudden emotional break rather than cold, premeditated intent. The jury was not persuaded that Daniel's emotional state at the time meaningfully reduced his legal culpability for 3 separate, deliberate acts of violence. After deliberating for several hours, jurors convicted Daniel on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. His sentencing hearing in June of 2026 became an emotionally devastating reckoning for 3 separate grieving families gathered in the same Queens courtroom. Yvette Sweeney's only child, Charlene Mackenzie, wept openly as she addressed her mother's killer directly, telling him that he hadn't merely taken a life, he had destroyed an entire family, and that her mother would always be remembered as the kind of person who lit up any room she walked into. Wayne Thomas's sister, McInnes Thomas, described in wrenching detail her imagined horror of her brother's final moments, choking on his own blood as he died from his wounds, made even more unbearable by the knowledge that his girlfriend of the moment had been butchered in the exact same manner just steps away in the same basement apartment. Colleen Fields' sister, Wendy, spoke through tears of a devastation that had rippled through her entire family in ways she said would last for generations. Queen's Supreme Court Justice Kenneth Holder, delivering what turned out to be the final sentencing of his long judicial career before retirement, did not soften his language for the occasion. He told Daniel directly there was, in his words, a special place reserved for someone like him, before handing down 3 consecutive life sentences without any possibility of parole. Daniel offered a brief, largely unconvincing statement of remorse to the court, but the courtroom's reaction, audible cheers erupting as the sentence was formally read into the record, made unmistakably clear that no apology from Daniel could ever undo what had happened inside that Milburn Street home in the early hours of a November morning. Despite Daniel's own attorney conceding that his guilt was never genuinely in dispute at trial, the case underscored with brutal clarity just how quickly an ordinary rent dispute, layered on top of a crumbling personal relationship, can converge into an act of unthinkable violence against people who had trusted him enough, quite literally, to call his house their home. Justice took nearly 3 years to arrive for this family, but it did arrive. If you believe sentences like this one send the right message, like this video and let us know in the comments. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Midnight Cold Case, because case number 4 is one of the most talked about landlord murders in modern true crime. Number 4, Michael Dudley. 2 teenagers filming a TikTok video on a beach thought they'd stumbled onto a suitcase full of cash. What they actually found inside would lead investigators straight back to their landlord. West Seattle's Alki Beach is one of the most popular waterfront stretches in the entire Pacific Northwest, a place for sunset walks, beach bonfires, and lazy summer afternoons along the shoreline of Puget Sound. 2 unsuspecting teenage girls on June 19, 2020. What began as an ordinary afternoon filming content for social media turned into the opening scene of one of Seattle's most disturbing homicide investigations in recent memory. The girls spotted a large suitcase washed up along the rocks near Duwamish Head, emitting what they described as a foul, unmistakable odor. Curious and thinking it might contain something valuable, they pried the suitcase open using sticks rather than their bare hands, and instead of cash or jewelry, found a black plastic trash bag stuffed inside. When police arrived shortly after and carefully opened the bag themselves, they discovered human remains. The entire chilling discovery had been captured on the girl's phone camera, unknowingly documenting the first public moment of a case that would eventually consume headlines across the region for years. The remains inside the suitcase were ultimately identified as 35-year-old Jessica Lewis and 27-year-old Austin Wenner, a couple who had been together for roughly 8 years and had both grown up in Washington state. Forensic investigators determined the pair had been shot, Lewis multiple times, Wenner once, approximately 10 days before their bodies were discovered on the beach, and that their remains had subsequently been dismembered and separated into multiple bags before being disposed of across several different bodies of water throughout the greater Seattle area, an apparent effort to scatter and complicate any potential recovery and identification. The investigative trail led directly back to their landlord, 62-year-old Michael Lee Dudley of Berrien, Washington, in whose home Lewis and Wenner had been renting a single bedroom. According to court documents filed in the case, the relationship between landlord and tenants had soured considerably over accusations of unpaid rent and, according to some reports, suspected theft from within the household, with Dudley reportedly growing increasingly insistent that the couple move out entirely. Neighbors living near Dudley's property told investigators that approximately 10 days before the suitcase was discovered on the beach, they had distinctly heard yelling and multiple gunshots coming from inside Dudley's residence. When Berrien police officers responded to that initial disturbance call, however, no one answered the door, and officers ultimately left the scene without further incident, a decision that, in retrospect, meant 2 victims may already have been lying dead inside the home at that very moment. Detectives eventually secured and served a search warrant on Dudley's home in August of 2020, uncovering bullet holes in the walls, spent shell casings, and significant blood evidence inside the specific bedroom where Lewis and Wenner had been staying as tenants. Cell phone location data further tied Dudley directly to the timeline of the crime, placing him near Alki Beach the day before the suitcase containing the remains was ultimately discovered by the 2 teenagers. He was taken into custody that same day and formally charged shortly thereafter. A forensic anthropologist retained by the state who personally examined the remains told investigators the dismemberment cuts appeared notably disorganized, executed in different manners using what appeared to be different tools altogether, expert testimony that led prosecutors to suggest though they were never able to definitively prove this theory in open court, that Dudley may have had assistance from at least one other person in disposing of the bodies. Charging documents filed by prosecutors described the entire dismemberment and disposal process as extraordinarily time-consuming and deliberate, underscoring what prosecutors characterized as Dudley's clear willingness to go to extreme lengths in order to conceal what he had done to his tenants. Dudley's eventual trial stretched across roughly 2 full months, becoming one of the longest homicide trials in recent King County history. Following a jury deliberation that lasted a day and a half, Dudley was convicted in December of 2022 on 2 separate counts of second-degree murder for the deaths of both Lewis and Wenner. Jurors additionally found that Dudley had used a firearm during the commission of both murders, a sentencing enhancement under Washington law that would ultimately add years directly onto his final punishment. At his sentencing hearing in April of 2023, both prosecutors and the victims' grieving families did not mince words in describing Dudley's character. Wenner's mother, Charlene Creans, addressed the court directly, describing Dudley as a predator who deliberately sought out vulnerable people specifically to exploit for his own personal benefit, characterizing him as manipulative and coldly calculated, and stating he deserved to spend every remaining day of his life behind bars without the possibility of freedom. King County Superior Court Judge Amy Sutton ultimately sentenced Dudley to the high end of the standard sentencing range on both counts, plus the mandatory firearm enhancement, totaling 560 months, well over 46 years, in state prison. Given Dudley's age at sentencing, he would be well past 100 years old before he would ever become eligible for release under the terms of his sentence. Lewis's aunt, Gina Jaschka, who had spoken extensively with regional reporters throughout the lengthy investigation and trial, said afterward that the final sentencing outcome had finally offered her extended family some genuine sense of closure, even as she openly acknowledged their lives had been permanently, irrevocably altered by the loss. Creans echoed a similar sentiment outside the courthouse, telling reporters that her son and his longtime partner could finally rest in peace, knowing with certainty that the man responsible for their brutal deaths would never again walk free among the public. What began as an entirely unremarkable summer afternoon at the beach for 2 teenagers filming social media content ultimately became the opening chapter of a case that gripped the entire Pacific Northwest region for years. A stark, sobering reminder that landlord-tenant disputes over rent and household trust, however mundane and commonplace they might initially seem, can spiral without warning into unimaginable violence when the person holding the keys to your home decides to become your judge, jury, and executioner all at once. This one still haunts the investigators who originally worked it. If it's haunting you too, hit like and tell us below. Would you have opened that suitcase? Subscribe to Midnight Cold Case, because number 5 involves a shooting caught entirely on camera by the victim himself. Number 5. Ellen Wink. He filmed his own killer pulling the trigger, and somehow, even with that footage in hand, prosecutors still had to fight through an entire trial to prove it was murder. Norwalk, Connecticut sits along the shores of Long Island Sound, a mid-sized city considered part of the greater New York metropolitan area, generally known for its quiet residential streets, its small marinas, and a small-town civic culture where local government officials are often recognizable faces around town. It was that very civic familiarity that made this particular case so unusual and unsettling for the community, because the woman ultimately accused of murder in this case wasn't simply a landlord dealing with a difficult tenant. Ellen Wink served as Norwalk's deputy Republican registrar of voters, had previously held the position of the city's clerk, and had even run, unsuccessfully, for a Connecticut state representative seat just 2 years before the killing. Wink owned 2 homes situated on Nelson Avenue, numbers 16 and 18, and rented out the property at number 16 to a 54-year-old tenant named Kurt Lametta. According to prosecutors, the relationship between landlord and tenant had been steadily deteriorating for well over a year prior to the killing, with the underlying dispute dating back to at least September of 2020, when Lametta reportedly stopped making his rent payments entirely. The conflict escalated dramatically enough that in September of 2021, months before the eventual shooting, Wink was arrested for the first time in connection with the feud, after allegedly locking Lametta out of the property entirely and throwing many of his personal belongings, including cash and jewelry, directly into the trash in an apparent attempt to force him out without going through formal eviction proceedings. On January 20th, 2022, the long-simmering conflict finally reached its violent breaking point. According to prosecutors who presented the case at trial, Wink walked into the Nelson Avenue property that particular afternoon with the clear, premeditated intention of killing her tenant once and for all. What set this case apart from almost every other case on this list is a single, extraordinary piece of evidence. Lametta, apparently sensing genuine danger as the confrontation began to unfold, secretly started recording the encounter on his own cell phone, inadvertently capturing the final moments of his own life on video. The resulting footage showed Wink firing her weapon at him, cursing loudly, and then firing 3 additional shots as he lay already wounded on the ground. That harrowing recording would go on to become the single most consequential piece of evidence presented during one of the most closely watched murder trials in the entire region's recent history. Police officers arriving at the scene found Lametta suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. He was formally pronounced dead at the scene by responding paramedics. Wink was arrested directly on site and initially charged with first-degree murder. Her bail, originally set at $1 million, was subsequently raised to $2.5 million after a reviewing judge personally watched the disturbingly graphic cell phone footage. Evidence prosecutors argued at the bail hearing constituted proof positive that Wink had committed a deliberate, premeditated killing rather than having acted in any genuine, immediate fear for her own safety. Wink's defense strategy at trial rested heavily on claims of self-defense combined with extreme emotional disturbance, arguing that years of escalating, exhausting conflict with her tenant had left her genuinely fearing for her physical safety, and that her ultimate actions, however undeniably tragic, did not amount to calculated, premeditated murder. Prosecutors methodically countered this defense by presenting a range of damning circumstantial evidence, including Wink's own personal internet search history in the weeks before the shooting, which reportedly included specific searches related to firearms and hollow-point ammunition. Evidence prosecutors described to the jury as proof of what one assistant state's attorney characterized in closing arguments as a planned and deliberate execution fueled by what she called Wink's visceral hatred toward her own tenant. A forensic psychologist retained by the defense testified at length regarding Wink's claimed fear of Lametta, while jurors also heard testimony from Wink's former boyfriend and reviewed a series of still images allegedly showing Wink pointing a firearm directly at Lametta on a separate occasion months before the fatal shooting, along with video footage documenting an earlier, non-fatal altercation between the two. In June of 2025, a jury sitting in Stanford Superior Court ultimately rejected Wink's combined claims of self-defense and extreme emotional disturbance, deliberating for just over 2 total hours spread across 2 separate days before returning a verdict finding her guilty of both murder and the separate charge of criminal lockout. Notably, jurors were never actually asked to determine whether Wink had in fact killed Lametta. That basic fact had never been genuinely in dispute, thanks entirely to his own self-recorded footage, but only whether her specific actions rose to the legal definition of murder under Connecticut criminal statute. At her sentencing hearing in September of 2025, prosecutors revealed publicly for the first time that Wink had previously turned down an offered plea deal that would have resulted in a comparatively lighter 40-year sentence in exchange for avoiding trial altogether. Having rejected that offer, she instead faced a statutory maximum of 60 years behind bars. Superior Court Judge John Blory ultimately sentenced her to 50 years in state prison, effectively a life sentence in practical terms, given that Wink was already 65 years old at the time her sentence was formally handed down. The case sent visible ripples of shock through Norwalk's local government structure, where Wink had spent years as a trusted, publicly elected official responsible for helping oversee the basic integrity of the city's elections. Neighbors living along Nelson Avenue told regional reporters in the aftermath that they were genuinely stunned a woman so publicly associated with decades of civic service could ultimately prove capable of such calculated, premeditated violence against a man who, right up until that particular January afternoon, had simply been trying, however unsuccessfully, to keep a roof over his own head. The chilling core lesson from this particular case is one prosecutors return to repeatedly throughout the trial. Sometimes the single most damning piece of evidence against a killer turns out to be the one piece of footage they never anticipated existing at all, recorded, in this case, by the very person they were about to kill. If you think that cell phone footage single-handedly sealed her fate, let us know in the comments. Like this video if this case surprised you as much as it surprised us, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case, because case number 6 shows just how fast a $100 dispute can spiral into a triple tragedy. Number 6. Philip Estevez. 2 children escaped through a second-story window while their own landlord hunted them through their apartment with a metal pipe, all because their family reportedly owed him $100. East New York, in Brooklyn, has long stood as one of New York City's more economically strained neighborhoods, where informal rental arrangements carved out inside single-family homes remain extremely common as struggling homeowners try to stay financially afloat amid the city's punishing cost of living. At 566 Shepherd Avenue, 63-year-old Philip Estevez rented out multiple separate floors of his personal residence as individual rental units, a basement apartment to 51-year-old Luis Martinez, and a distinct second-floor unit to a woman named Ana Rodriguez, who lived there together with her husband and their 2 young children, an 11-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl. On March 10, 2013, whatever long-simmering frustration Estevez had reportedly been harboring over unpaid rent. Some contemporaneous reports suggested the specific dispute in question involved as little as $100 allegedly owed by Rodriguez, though neighbors also separately pointed to ongoing friction over shared utility costs within the building, exploded without warning into extreme, sustained violence. According to the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, Estevez initially confronted Rodriguez directly over the outstanding debt. Martinez, attempting to defend his sister from the escalating confrontation, physically stepped in between them. Estevez responded by pulling out a handgun and shooting Martinez 3 separate times, twice in the head, once directly in the chest, killing him almost instantly at the scene. But the eruption of violence inside the Shepherd Avenue property didn't end there. Estevez then proceeded upstairs, where Rodriguez had already managed to lock herself and her 2 terrified children inside their second-floor apartment, desperately attempting to hide from him. Estevez forced his way into the locked unit, now armed with a metal pipe, and struck both Rodriguez and her 12-year-old daughter directly in the head with a weapon. In a desperate, split-second bid to escape the apartment and summon help, Rodriguez's 11-year-old son jumped directly out of the building's second-story window, breaking his foot severely on impact with the pavement below, but nonetheless managing to run, injured, to the local police precinct several blocks away to raise the alarm. His sister eventually managed to escape the apartment as well, reportedly only after striking Estevez with a heavy block of wood in a desperate act of self-defense. When responding police officers finally arrived at the Shepherd Avenue property, they found Martinez already dead at the scene. Estevez was taken into custody without further incident, and would later claim the entire violent episode had been an act of self-defense, insisting to investigators that his own tenants had attacked him first, unprovoked. Neighbors in the surrounding area, visibly stunned by the sheer scale of violence that had unfolded, described Estevez to reporters afterward as an intensely hardworking man who kept largely to himself, struggling openly to reconcile that previously mundane image with the brutality of what had just occurred inside his own home. Estevez was formally charged with murder and attempted murder, and his resulting case ultimately went to trial before Brooklyn Supreme Court Justice Albert Tomei. Prosecutors laid out for the jury a chilling, methodical sequence of events that they argued represented anything but a single act of self-defense, describing instead what they characterized as a targeted execution immediately followed by an extended spree of violence directed against a woman and her 2 young children, none of whom had any direct involvement whatsoever in the original underlying rent dispute. In May of 2015, a jury ultimately convicted Estevez of second-degree murder, 3 separate counts of second-degree assault, and 2 separate counts of endangering the welfare of a child. He was sentenced the following month to 15 years to life in state prison. Brooklyn District Attorney Ken Thompson stated publicly at the time that Estevez had ultimately destroyed not only his victim's life, but his own as well, predicting Estevez would likely spend the overwhelming majority of his remaining days behind bars. However, the case took a genuinely unusual and complicating turn in November of 2017, when New York's Appellate Division formally reversed Estevez's original conviction, ruling specifically that the presiding trial judge had repeatedly and prejudicially questioned Estevez while he testified in his own defense on the witness stand, and had additionally intervened extensively during multiple witness examinations in a manner the appellate panel ultimately found had compromised Estevez's fundamental right to a fair and impartial trial. The appellate court's order sent the entire case back down to Kings County Supreme Court for a completely new trial to be conducted. It's worth being fully transparent here with our audience. Publicly available court records clearly confirm both the appellate reversal and the formal order directing a full retrial, but a clear, independently confirmed final outcome of that subsequent retrial proceeding proved genuinely difficult to verify through available public reporting during our research process. What remains entirely beyond dispute, firmly established through original court documents, the Brooklyn District Attorney's own contemporaneous press releases, and multiple independent news reports published at the time, is that Luis Martinez was shot to death inside their home, that Ana Rodriguez and her 2 young children were violently attacked in the same incident, and that a jury did, at minimum on 1 occasion, find Estevez guilty of that underlying violence. The case remains a genuinely sobering illustration of how the American legal system, even after delivering what initially appears to be a decisive, resolute jury verdict, can still leave behind a lingering trail of unanswered procedural questions for the very families left grieving in its wake. Questions that, for both the Rodriguez and Martinez families, may ultimately never see the same kind of definitive closure other cases featured on this list eventually reached. This one's a sobering reminder that justice isn't always a straight line from crime to final resolution. If you want us to dig deeper into other cases with genuinely complicated legal outcomes like this one, tell us in the comments below, hit like on this video, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case, because number 7 is one of the most recent, still developing cases on this entire list. Number 7. Ricky Miller. A frantic phone call placed by a terrified family member. A confession made before police even arrived on scene. And a 71-year-old man's body, hidden inside a large plastic barrel, just steps away from where he had been quietly living for years. Woodland, Washington is a small, sparsely populated rural community situated roughly midway between the major metropolitan areas of Seattle and Portland, the kind of place where individual properties stretch across acres of dense forest, and where neighbors often live far enough apart from one another that a single scream might genuinely never reach the next house over. On a stretch of Old Lewis River Road, 67-year-old Ricky Dean Miller owned a rural property where he allowed a tenant, 71-year-old Dennis Eugene Schmidt, to live independently in a separate tiny home constructed on the same parcel of land. On December 16, 2025, at just before 7 o'clock in the evening, Cowlitz County's Emergency 911 Dispatch Center received a call reporting what was initially described only in vague terms as suspicious circumstances taking place at the property. The caller explained to dispatchers that they had just spoken directly with a family member, Miller himself, who had openly admitted to killing someone and then hiding that person's body somewhere on his own rural property. Sheriff's deputies responded to the property immediately and made direct contact with Miller at the scene. Detectives quickly secured a formal search warrant for the property, and during their subsequent search, they discovered exactly what the original tipster had described over the phone: the body of Dennis Schmidt, deliberately concealed inside a large barrel positioned somewhere on the sprawling property. An autopsy conducted in the days that followed determined that Schmidt had suffered multiple significant blunt force injuries specifically to his head, along with clear physical evidence of strangulation, findings strongly indicating a violent, sustained physical altercation rather than any single, sudden, impulsive act of violence. Neighbors living along the remote stretch of Old Lewis River Road told local television reporters in the days following the arrest that they were genuinely stunned by the discovery, repeatedly describing the surrounding area as remote, quiet, and about the very last place anyone might expect a homicide investigation to unfold. Several residents interviewed by reporters said they didn't personally know either Miller or Schmidt particularly well, noting that most people in the area tend to keep largely to themselves given the rural, spread-out nature of the properties. But at least one neighbor, who declined to be identified on camera out of an apparent concern for their own privacy and safety, told reporters they had frequently heard yelling and physical fighting coming from the direction of the property in the weeks and months leading up to the killing, a troubling pattern that, viewed in hindsight, may well have been steadily building toward the eventual violence that ultimately claimed Schmidt's life. Miller was formally booked into the Cowlitz County Jail on charges of second-degree murder and the unlawful disposal of human remains. It's important that we be entirely straightforward with you about exactly where this particular case currently stands. As of this recording, Ricky Miller has been formally charged but has not yet actually stood trial, and no jury verdict of any kind has been reached in his case. This case remains fully active and ongoing, and like any individual formally charged with a crime within the American criminal justice system, Miller is legally presumed entirely innocent unless and until he is proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in an actual court of law. We are including this particular case here on our list because the underlying, established facts, the original 911 call, the subsequent search warrant, the physical discovery of Schmidt's body inside the barrel, and the currently pending charges, are all confirmed matters of public record, directly verified through official statements released by the Cowlitz County Sheriff's Office itself. We'll continue watching this particular case closely as it slowly moves through the legal system in the months ahead, and if and when there are meaningful updates to report, we will absolutely bring them directly to you. What makes this particular case so genuinely unsettling isn't any complicated legal maneuvering or a decades-long cold case suddenly cracking open. It's how disarmingly simply the entire thing began. A single confession made to a family member, one phone call, and a body that had been deliberately hidden in relative plain sight, along a quiet rural road where, until that December evening, absolutely nobody thought to look. Because this particular case remains genuinely unresolved and still actively unfolding, we want to hear your take directly. Do you think rural landlord-tenant living arrangements like this specific one inherently carry more hidden risk than typical urban rentals? Let us know your thoughts down below in the comments, like this video, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case so you're notified the very moment we are able to bring you a meaningful update on this particular case. Number 8. Peter Balraj. A landlord who couldn't manage to collect his own rent decided instead to send 2 other men to do the collecting for him, and one of those men ultimately decided a shooting would settle the debt permanently. San Antonio, Texas ranks among the fastest growing major cities in the entire country, And with that explosive growth has come increasingly intense disputes between landlords desperately trying to keep their rental units filled and tenants genuinely struggling to keep pace with the region's rapidly rising cost of living. On the city's north side, specifically in the 3200 block of Nantucket Drive, that broader regional tension turned unmistakably deadly in December of 2022. 32-year-old Christopher Vargas had been renting a home directly from 62-year-old landlord Peter Balraj. According to prosecutors with the Bexar County District Attorney's Office, Balraj had grown increasingly frustrated over months spent unsuccessfully attempting to collect significant past-due rent from Vargas, and ultimately wanted him removed from the property entirely. Rather than pursuing a legitimate, lawful eviction process through the proper Texas courts, Balraj instead allegedly turned to his own daughter's boyfriend, a man named Joshua Walls, specifically enlisting his help to intimidate Vargas into both paying his outstanding debt and vacating the property voluntarily. Walls, in turn, brought along his own roommate, a man named Adrian Gomez, to assist with the confrontation. In the early morning hours of December 18, 2022, Walls and Gomez traveled together to Vargas's rented home. According to testimony later presented at trial, a heated confrontation broke out after Vargas reportedly brandished a knife at some point during the tense encounter. Gomez, in a recorded statement to detectives that struck many observers as almost dismissive of the gravity of what had just occurred, described firing a single shot specifically toward Vargas's leg, though he would later suggest to investigators that he personally believed the shot had missed its intended target entirely. It hadn't. Vargas was ultimately found dead inside his own rented home, with responding detectives specifically noting a large quantity of blood pooled beneath his body at the scene. All three men involved, Balraj, Walls, and Gomez, were subsequently arrested and formally charged with murder under Texas's distinctive law of parties doctrine, a specific legal principle that allows individuals to be held fully criminally responsible for a killing physically carried out by someone else entirely, provided prosecutors can demonstrate they meaningfully conspired in or knowingly facilitated the underlying criminal act. Because Walls had already confessed directly to shooting Vargas and had personally accompanied Gomez to the fatal confrontation, prosecutors made the strategic decision to bring him to trial first among the three co-defendants. Walls's individual trial began in February of 2025. Jurors were shown recorded video of his formal police interview, during which he described in detail both the confrontation itself and Gomez firing what turned out to be the fatal shot. Walls was ultimately found guilty and, facing up to life imprisonment under Texas sentencing guidelines, was formally sentenced later that same year. Gomez, the individual who had actually pulled the trigger during the fatal confrontation, was also separately convicted and sentenced around the same general time frame. That left Peter Balraj, the man prosecutors argued had set this entire deadly chain of events into motion in the first place, simply by asking his own daughter's boyfriend to intimidate his struggling tenant rather than pursuing any lawful legal remedy available to him as a landlord. Balraj's own trial in Bexar County's 290th District Court ultimately culminated on June 30, 2026, when a jury formally convicted him of murder, along with 2 separate counts of aggravated assault and 1 additional count of tampering with physical evidence at the crime scene. Prosecutors argued forcefully throughout the trial that even though Balraj himself had never personally fired a single shot, his deliberate decision to orchestrate an intimidation scheme rather than simply pursue a lawful eviction process directly and foreseeably led to Christopher Vargas's ultimate death. Balraj was sentenced to 45 years in state prison. His conviction formally closed out a complex case that had taken roughly 3.5 full years to completely resolve across 3 entirely separate criminal defendants, powerfully illustrating just how far-reaching the ultimate legal consequences can become when a frustrated landlord makes the fateful decision to handle an ordinary rent dispute entirely outside the formal legal system, effectively deputizing other people to handle the intimidating, and ultimately, tragically, the killing, on his own behalf. For the extended Vargas family, the long wait for full legal accountability spanned multiple years and 3 entirely separate criminal trials. But by the summer of 2026, all 3 men connected to Christopher Vargas's violent death, the man who actually pulled the trigger, the man who personally brought him to the confrontation, and the landlord whose frustration with unpaid rent had set the entire tragic chain of events into motion in the first place, had each been formally convicted and sentenced for their respective roles in his death. This particular case proves definitively that facing murder charges doesn't necessarily require personally pulling the trigger yourself. If that surprised you, like this video and tell us in the comments below. Subscribe to Midnight Cold Case, because number 9 involves a child, a padlocked security gate, and a fire that never should have happened in the first place. Number 9, James G. Walker. A 10-year-old boy and a 40-year-old man were ultimately found together in each other's arms, unable to escape a raging fire because the only viable exit had been deliberately sealed behind a padlocked security gate that required separate keys from both sides to open. Washington, D.C. Kennedy Street corridor, situated in the city's northwest quadrant, is a densely populated residential area, home to a large number of immigrant families actively searching for genuinely affordable housing within one of the single most expensive rental markets found anywhere in the entire country. At 708 Kennedy Street, 67-year-old James G. Walker, notably a licensed practicing attorney by profession, operated what authorities would later formally describe as an entirely illegal, unlicensed rooming house, cramming as many as a full dozen separate tenants, many of them Ethiopian immigrant families, into a single building that had never been legally approved for residential occupancy of any kind. Tenants living inside the property told investigators they were each paying somewhere between $300 and $550 per month for individual rooms within the severely overcrowded structure. The building itself entirely lacked any valid certificate of occupancy required under DC law. It had absolutely no functioning smoke alarms installed anywhere throughout the structure, including critically within the basement level where the eventual fire would ultimately break out. Several of the individually rented rooms inside the building were far too small under applicable code to legally qualify as habitable living space in the first place, and multiple rooms had no windows whatsoever. Most dangerously of all, Walker had personally installed multiple separate security gates throughout the interior of the building that specifically required physical keys to open from both the inside and the outside simultaneously, including one particularly hazardous double-keyed gate that completely blocked the direct path running from the kitchen area to the building's front door, which would have otherwise served as tenants' fastest and most direct means of emergency escape. Months before tragedy ultimately struck the building, a Metropolitan Police Department officer named Ernie Davis had personally discovered the dangerous, life-threatening conditions inside the property during a routine patrol and had formally warned Walker directly, on March 21, 2019, that his building was in clear violation of numerous applicable fire safety codes. According to prosecutors who later presented evidence at trial, Walker never made any of the necessary corrections to address these documented violations. On the morning of August 18, 2019, a fire broke out inside the basement level of the Kennedy Street building. 3 separate residents were inside the structure at the time the fire began. 2 of them, 40-year-old Fitsum Kabeda and 10-year-old Yafet Solomon, became completely trapped inside the basement, entirely unable to escape through the building's deliberately obstructed emergency exits. Bystanders who had gathered outside, along with responding DC police officers, desperately attempted to physically tear open the locked iron security gate as people trapped inside could clearly be heard screaming for help from within the burning structure. Ultimately, their efforts weren't enough. Both Kabeda and the young 10-year-old boy died from a combination of thermal burns and severe smoke inhalation. When their bodies were finally recovered by emergency crews after the fire was extinguished, they were found together, having apparently spent their final terrifying moments literally holding each other in their arms. The underlying tragedy was further compounded by a separate, troubling administrative failure entirely apart from Walker's own personal conduct. The district's Office of Unified Communications later formally admitted that it had taken more than 4 full minutes to actually dispatch firefighters to the scene after the initial emergency call first came in, a critical delay that, while entirely separate from Walker's own building code violations, added yet another distinct layer of institutional failure on top of an already highly preventable tragedy. Walker was ultimately arrested in Baltimore in January of 2020 and formally indicted on 2 separate counts of second-degree murder, along with additional lesser charges of involuntary manslaughter and literally dozens of individual criminal building code violations. Prosecutors argued at trial that Walker's own documented knowledge of the extremely dangerous conditions existing inside his building, combined with what they characterized as his conscious, ongoing disregard for the extreme risk of death those specific conditions clearly posed to his tenants, made him fully criminally responsible for both deaths, even though he personally hadn't set the fire himself and wasn't even physically present at the property when the blaze initially broke out. Legally speaking, this particular prosecutorial theory is sometimes referred to as a depraved heart or extreme recklessness theory of murder, the broader legal principle that knowingly maintaining conditions almost certain to eventually kill someone can constitute actual murder under the law, just as surely as directly inflicting physical harm through a more conventional assault. The case moved notably slowly through the district's court system. Walker ultimately wasn't convicted until February of 2025, roughly 5.5 full years after the original fatal fire. A DC Superior Court jury ultimately found him guilty on both counts of second-degree murder, as well as all 27 separate criminal building code violations he had been formally charged with. At his sentencing hearing in May of 2025, Walker read aloud from a specific psalm before the court formally delivered its final judgment against him. He offered an apology to the court, telling the presiding judge he had only ever genuinely intended to provide affordable housing options to people who couldn't otherwise afford housing on their own, insisting repeatedly that he never meant for anyone to actually be harmed as a result of his business practices. Superior Court Judge Todd Edelman was entirely unmoved by these claims, openly calling the sentence he was about to formally impose effectively a death sentence given Walker's advanced age, and ultimately sentenced him to nearly 36 years in state prison, to be followed by 5 additional years of supervised release upon any eventual completion of his sentence. The judge specifically singled out and praised Officer Ernie Davis for his diligence in originally identifying the hazardous conditions inside the building and formally warning Walker well before the fatal fire, while simultaneously and sharply criticizing the city's own licensing and code enforcement agency for its own separate failure to ever follow up and ensure that documented violations were actually corrected before tragedy struck. Yafet Solomon's grieving mother later filed a separate civil wrongful death lawsuit against Walker, who told the court during related proceedings that he was actively in the process of selling off various properties in order to satisfy the hundreds of thousands of dollars in civil damages he had agreed to pay as part of an eventual settlement. She has said publicly, in the years since, that she now marks her late son's birthday each year with a genuinely complicated mixture of both quiet celebration and profound ongoing mourning. Because this particular case involves the tragic death of a child in circumstances directly tied to unsafe, illegal housing conditions, we want to pause here briefly for anyone in our audience who might need it. If you are a parent, guardian, or concerned community member with genuine concerns about a child's safety or living conditions, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline remains available completely free, fully confidential, and around the clock at 1-800-422-4453. You are never wrong to make that call. This particular case stands as a devastating reminder that pure negligence can ultimately prove every bit as deadly as direct, intentional violence. If this case moved you the way it moved us, please like this video, and let us know down in the comments. Should landlords realistically face murder charges more often in cases specifically involving genuinely unsafe housing conditions like this one? Subscribe to Midnight Cold Case, because our final case on this list is still actively making headlines right now, in real time, as we speak. Number 10. Philippe Chagnier. A masked figure approaching quietly on a bicycle in the pre-dawn darkness. A parked car deliberately set on fire as bait, and a tenant lured directly outside his own front door, straight into a calculated ambush involving a fully automatic weapon. San Francisco's outer Sunset neighborhood is a characteristically foggy, tightly knit stretch of the city situated near the Pacific coastline, filled predominantly with modest single-family homes that have become increasingly valuable, and correspondingly increasingly contested, amid California's ongoing, deepening statewide housing crisis. It was on 47th Avenue within this specific neighborhood that 58-year-old Eric Bigone, a laborer employed by the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, had been renting a modest single-family home since 2023, paying $3,200 each month, according to a subsequent civil lawsuit, largely in physical cash payments. His landlords were 68-year-old Philippe Chagnier, a former practicing dentist whose California dental license had actually expired back in 2024, and his wife, Barbara. According to a wrongful death civil lawsuit later formally filed by Bygone's own son, the couple began systematically pressuring Bigone to voluntarily leave the rental property starting in January of 2026, allegedly issuing a series of legally improper notices to enter the property, repeatedly threatening formal eviction, and eventually refusing outright to accept any of his ongoing rent payments, despite having previously insisted for years that they be paid exclusively in cash, which the lawsuit specifically alleges was originally intended to help the couple illegally evade taxes owed on the rental income they were earning. The civil lawsuit further claims the Chagniers falsely and repeatedly invoked California's Ellis Act, a specific state law that technically allows landlords to remove a property from the rental market entirely under certain conditions, without the couple ever actually following through on the specific legal process genuinely required to invoke that law properly. Bigone reportedly ended up hiring his own attorney simply to ensure he could legally continue paying his rent and remain lawfully in his own home. When these sustained pressure tactics ultimately failed to force Bigone out of the property voluntarily, prosecutors allege the entire situation escalated dramatically and violently. In the early morning hours of May 17, 2026, someone approached the 47th Avenue rental property on a bicycle at approximately 5 o'clock in the morning, dressed entirely in dark clothing and wearing a concealing mask. Before launching the actual attack, The masked figure allegedly first spray-painted several nearby security cameras specifically to avoid being caught clearly on camera, then deliberately set fire to the roof of Bygone's own parked car directly outside the home. When Big One came outside in his pajamas to investigate the commotion and attempt to extinguish the flames himself, he was shot directly in the back using a silenced, fully automatic firearm. According to San Francisco police, the shooter then reportedly stood directly over Big One as he lay wounded on the ground and deliberately fired again, execution style, before fleeing the immediate scene on the very same bicycle he had arrived on. Big One died right where he fell on the pavement outside his own rented home. San Francisco investigators subsequently turned to the city's extensive network of flock safety license plate readers and traffic cameras positioned throughout the neighborhood to carefully trace the shooter's exact escape path, ultimately following the bicycle to a nearby parked vehicle and eventually tracking that specific vehicle directly back to a residence located in the city's separate Ingleside neighborhood, which turned out to be Philippe Chagniet's own home. When police officers arrived to execute a search warrant, they reportedly discovered a fully automatic machine gun, a firearm silencer, and a high-capacity ammunition magazine inside the residence. Chagniet was formally arrested on May 27, 2026, and charged with murder carrying the special circumstance allegation of lying in wait, a specific charge under California law that can carry the potential penalty of life in prison without any possibility of parole, along with additional separate charges of assault with an automatic firearm, arson, and multiple distinct firearm possession violations. At his formal arraignment hearing, Chagniet pleaded not guilty to all charges filed against him. In a genuinely strange twist that has drawn considerable additional media attention to this particular case, subsequent reporting has revealed that Chagniet was previously connected, in an entirely separate capacity, to a completely different 19-year-old murder case, having personally provided testimony that helped secure the 2006 conviction of a San Mateo man named Joseph Quah for the murder of an elderly couple whose property Quah had previously managed on their behalf. Quah has consistently maintained his own innocence in that entirely separate, earlier case over the years, and has separately alleged in a subsequent court petition that Chagniet's original testimony against him back in 2006 was itself false, allegations that, as of this recording, remain entirely unproven and constitute a completely separate, unresolved legal matter with no direct bearing on the current pending murder charges. Bygone's own son, Dino, formally filed a wrongful death civil lawsuit against both Chagniets in early June of 2026, seeking both financial damages and a specific court order intended to halt the couple's already planned sale of the rental property. A planned sale the civil lawsuit directly alleges was itself the entire underlying motive behind his father's brutal killing in the first place. The civil suit describes one especially chilling specific detail. The very day after Bygone's murder, Barbara Chagniet reportedly telephoned his grieving son directly to offer her personal condolences, only to ask him, within that very same brief conversation, precisely when he would realistically be able to vacate the rental property. It's important that we state clearly here that Philippe Chagniet has only been formally charged, not yet convicted of anything, and that under long-standing American legal principles, he remains presumed entirely innocent unless and until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in an actual court of law. His underlying criminal case has not yet even gone to trial as of this recording. We are covering this particular case here because the specific facts alleged by prosecutors and clearly outlined in extensive, detailed law enforcement statements already constitute confirmed matters of public record, but we will absolutely continue following this particular case closely as it develops, and if and when an eventual verdict is ultimately reached, we will bring that important update directly to you. What stands out most powerfully about this particular final case isn't simply its sheer brutality, it's genuinely how recent the entire thing actually is. While most of the other cases featured throughout this list took multiple years to finally reach a courtroom setting, this particular case is still unfolding in real time, essentially right now, serving as a stark, sobering reminder that the disturbing overall pattern explored throughout this entire video isn't merely some relic confined to the past. It's still actively happening today. That's all 10 cases. If you made it all the way through this entire video, you clearly appreciate deep, genuinely thoroughly researched true crime content. So do us one simple favor. Like this video, tell us directly in the comment section below which specific case on this list disturbed you the very most, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case, because we bring you a brand new, fully verified case just like these every single week.